All right. Dr. Jukes, can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. So I'm Dr. Jukes. I'm the head of the politics department and a politics teacher at school.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you some questions today about general politics in the UK and across the globe.
Okay.
How do you think the United Kingdom's current position in the world stage would be different if we voted to remain in 2016?
So I think there's a couple of different things with a question like this. One is the economic impact, which is very hard to judge because, for one thing, it's a kind of counterfactual. We'll never quite know what would have happened to the economy without Brexit. But also there's so many other factors since then, you can talk about the war in Ukraine, you can talk about the impact of COVID, that there'll always be a kind of get out for Brexiteers to say, well, it wasn't Brexit, it was this, it was that. And they're not totally wrong about that. There has been a global inflation crisis, for instance. But I think even the government's own analysis suggests that there's been an economic harm done by Brexit. But I think the other thing that maybe is clearer and easier to measure in some ways is the impact it's had on the UK's reputation in the world. I think that Britain had always had a reputation for sort of sensible, almost a bit dull government. We don't have revolutions, we don't do big moments of crisis and change. And I think that Brexit, and then following up with Johnson's, having Johnson as Prime Minister, that kind of move towards populism is not really something we'd seen in the UK before. And I think that it left the rest. I was living in Belgium at the time of the Brexit vote, and a lot of people there just felt like this isn't the UK we thought we knew. We thought that the UK was kind of sensible and rational about their way they do things, and this sort of lurch towards radical change and populism is just something they didn't expect. And I think that still is having a knock-on effect on our position, our reputation in the world.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because there's so many things that happened after Brexit which are significant and have affected where the UK is on the world stage. It's difficult to say if the Brexit referendum was the thing that's changed, has changed the UK.
Yeah, I think, but it is very difficult to say. But I think there are certain things that are more concrete that we can point out. So, for instance, we're much less used to the US as an ally today than we were in the EU. The US did not want us to leave the EU because actually they really valued having the UK in there, with similar ideas, similar viewpoints, almost as a kind of US voice inside the EU, putting forward those positions. And I think the US looks at us today as a much less useful ally because we just don't hold that kind of institutional power to represent, to sort of push forward their worldview anymore. Whereas, I think the economic side is just much harder to say.
We were sort of the US's puppet in Europe, and now we're not.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. I think that we weren't necessarily their puppet. We just see things in a similar way. We've, that as a result of the shared history, I think the shared values, we just tend to see things in a similar kind of way. And they valued that because sometimes there is a slightly different position in France or Germany when it comes to things like the Iraq War. France was not in favour of that, or even the Libya intervention in 2011. Germany was very kind of lukewarm on that. So generally, the UK has sort of taken the US side, and they view the US views the EU as a major global power. So having us inside it was useful to them. I think outside it was just less relevant.
Yeah, and then obviously within the UK itself, there's Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. There was in 2014 there was a referendum of devolution of Scotland, whether they were going to leave the Union, and then obviously there was the EU referendum in 2016, and that has changed the Scottish opinion on whether they still think that the right thing to do is to be in the Union. So do you think that the United Kingdom will still be a Union in 10 years' time, 20 years' time?
10 probably, 20 I'm not convinced, but actually I don't think it'll be Scotland.
Do you not?
Leaves. I think the thing with Scotland is that leaving the EU made independence more attractive for Scotland, because obviously Scotland didn't want to leave, Scotland voted to remain. So this sort of idea of the SNP that they're being dragged out of the EU against their will. However, I think it makes the argument for Scottish independence stronger, but it makes the difficulties of doing it just so much more complex.
Yeah.
If we were still in the EU, then Scotland leaving the UK would be very, very simple. We'd both be in the EU. There'd be no need for any borders. And what we've seen with the situation with Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Protocol is just how complicated it is to have a border between the UK and the EU. And the idea that Scotland could leave and then rejoin the EU, we would effectively need to have a border. We need to check who was going in and out of Scotland. We need to check which goods were going in and out of Scotland, tied to issues like the currency, which would be extremely complex to resolve. I just think that actually, even if there's another independence referendum, once we start getting into the arguments about what that would look, because Scotland has to be a member of the EU, an independent Scotland has to be a member of the EU. I don't think it survives without being so, it's too small.
Yeah.
But I think the complexity of having a Scotland in the EU bordering a UK or what's left of it that's not is just so much more complex than even the situation with Ireland and Northern Ireland has been, and that's why I just think in reality it won't happen. I think Northern Ireland will be the one.
Yeah. So there's obviously the big thing going on at the moment, the Ukraine war. What do you think the result of that will be?
So I have to preface this by saying I have a very bad record of predictions. I did predict confidently that Putin wouldn't invade.
I've seen the videos.
Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't put any confidence in my predictions. The key thing is that Putin has to become convinced that he can't win militarily. He will not be interested in any kind of peace negotiation while he still believes that he can achieve his objectives through military means. And I think the trouble with this is, if I was Putin right now, I'd be looking at the US, looking at the elections coming up in November 2024, looking at the Republicans, looking at Trump, and thinking, if the Republicans win, support for the Ukrainians stops or certainly reduces. And at that point, I think he can still achieve his objectives militarily. So I just don't see why he would be interested in peace until that has happened.
Well, a lot of the weapon support has already been cut because of the shutdown, I think, earlier this week.
Yeah, they didn't get any extra money for it.
There's no extra money's gone to Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I think it's all dependent on, as you said, who wins the 2024 election.
Yeah.
Because then either support will increase again or it will cut.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think with that you can look. You can talk about support from the EU and support from the UK, but when you look at the figures, American support dwarfs anybody else by so much. It's the only thing that really matters. Yeah. Everything else is sort of symbolic, and I'm sure I don't want to completely underplay it, but it is all about the American support, the American money. And like you say, I think if Biden wins and recommits to supporting Ukraine, then there's maybe a chance for peace negotiations, because Putin says, well, I can't win, there's at least another 4 years, I've got to get out of this, it's costing too much, or we're taking too many losses, and then there's a chance of a peace negotiation. What that would look like, I don't know, but I imagine it would involve Russia getting to keep some of the territories that it seized. But for the time being, I just think, why would you make peace now when there's a chance that the Republicans win, the support gets cut, and you can basically achieve what you wanted to anyway? So I'm not that optimistic.
So saying that scenario where Russia wins, I'm doing like a bunny, it's not a video, but I'm doing like a bunny sort of thing there if they win. But what will actually happen if, say, because they'll say they take the whole of the Ukrainian territory, what happens after that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I think that's likely anymore. I mean, Russia's initial goal was to very quickly wipe out Zelensky and the government and install a kind of Russian puppet regime in power. I'm not sure that's likely. I'm not sure even that's what a Russian win looks like anymore. I think probably, keeping Crimea, keeping the 4 territories inside Ukraine that they've sort of seized, probably that's enough to be presented as a win. What happens? I mean, I guess it turns into a kind of frozen conflict where... Sort
of like the South Korea, North Korea thing,
where
it's a stalemate. Yeah,
I mean, Ukraine's not going to accept that. Certainly not in the long term. So it may well become a kind of frozen conflict, but then the issues will all be about Ukraine's status. Do we is Ukraine allowed to join the EU? Is it allowed to join NATO?
Yeah.